Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Welcome back, sir. Always a delight and a pleasure to have you in the studio, even though you're not in the studio.
I'm in the studio. You're not looking carefully.
Technically, you are. You're like on 2 or 3 different screens at this moment, so that's very helpful. That's very helpful. Wow. I can't believe we're actually getting past Paul. This is going to be interesting.
Well, you know what? We've had a lot of holidays this month. I think that made it hard for us to meet on Mondays because the holidays were Monday nights. But we're finally finishing the book of Hebrews.
Yes.
I'm excited because the next book is the book of Yaakov, the book of James.
Mm-hmm. Right on.
And
hey, Rabbi, real quickly, I think your camera is either shifted or something. It looks like it's pointing a little too high. Can you tilt it down for me a touch?
1 second.
Okay, there we go.
How's that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
That's perfect?
Yes, sir. Just as you are.
Okay.
Very good.
So anyway, I'm looking forward to James, and it'll be an interesting study. But let's finish off Hebrews,
right
chapter 13.
Mm-hmm.
And one topic.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I think James is going to be a lot of fun. I think because it's like in my opinion, it never matched the MO of the entire New Testament at all. It seemed like it was like stuck back in the quote unquote Old Testament.
Well, that's why we know that Martin Luther did not like it and he wanted to kick it out.
Gotcha.
He called it the straw epistle.
The straw epistle.
And,
that's funny.
Wow. He was not a big fan of James, and I find it a very interesting letter. Right. So I'm looking forward to that. Hebrews, I'm never a big fan of Hebrews. I happen to have some Hebrew friends, but the book of Hebrews never really tickled me that much.
Right.
And as we say, James was a fun guy, into mushrooms, a fun guy.
Oh,
okay.
Please do tell. All right, I'll let you get going. Here we go. Hebrews 13, closing the book. Hebrews
13, look, one topic that we have discussed many times in the past, actually exclusively with Paul, because we've been really focusing mainly on Paul's writings, is that when we read these Greek scriptures, when we read these epistles and letters that make up the New Testament, it's clear that what we have are private, personal letters. That's what we're reading. We're reading letters that were written by individuals to a specific audience, and these are personal letters, and not divine revelation to the entire world for all time. And that's an important thing to bear in mind, that the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, basically when Isaiah wrote, when the 5 books of Moses were written, these were given as revelation by God for all time and for all people. And that's not what we have here in the Christian Bible. In the Greek scriptures, in the New Testament, we basically have individuals who are writing their own personal letters. There's absolutely zero evidence that these are divinely inspired. And it's just clear from the context that these are personal letters from person A to person B or to people B. Now, one clue for this in this chapter is the reference to your leaders, and we find this phrase in verses 7, 17, and 24. 3 times the writer here makes reference to your leaders. So it's obviously speaking to a particular group of people, at that time. There was an audience, there were recipients of this letter. And so the writer makes reference to your leaders. And it's interesting that David Stern, in his commentary to this chapter, David Stern's a Messianic Jew, and his commentary to this chapter, he makes the following, I think, very revealing statement. This is what he says. These references to quote-unquote your leaders suggest that chapter 13 was appended as a covering letter, or we would say cover letter, accompanying the summary of sermons constituting chapters 1 through 12, and was addressed to individuals in the congregation whom the author knew personally. Perhaps they had heard him give these series of sermons orally and had requested a written summary from him. So, this again makes it very, very clear that we're dealing here with a text that was a private, personal communication between, we don't know who the writer is, the writer of Hebrews, and his audience. That's all it was meant to be. And when we pay attention to this, which really is something that comes up throughout the Greek scriptures, it's obvious that what we have before us here is a private communication. Well, it's no longer private, but it was originally a private communication that ended up being canonized as part of the collection of letters comprising the New Testament and hyped as divine revelation, meaning that it was never written as divine revelation. Its origin was not divine revelation. The writers don't claim, nowhere in the letter, in these books, in the book of Hebrews, does the writer claim that this letter was revealed to him by God. But the people who edited or redacted or canonized the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, this is, at least according to Orthodox Christianity, more liberal Christians readily dismiss this, but let's say normative Orthodox Christianity accepts the fact that they're in this book, they're in the quote-unquote Bible, so that means by definition that this was divinely revealed. This is just the same as Deuteronomy or Isaiah. But it's very clear when you actually read the text that that's not what we're dealing with. So let's just look as an example at the last 4 verses in this chapter where this is clearly revealed to us as a personal letter. All you need to do is just open your ears and listen to what is written, and you can see this was a personal letter. So the writer says, "But I urge you, brethren," I, the writer, "I urge you, brethren, bear with this word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly." Right? He's basically saying, I've written you this brief missive, this brief letter. I have written it to you. It's not saying that I'm transmitting this message from God to the entire world for eternity. One more time, he says, "But I urge you, brethren," the readers of this letter, "bear with this word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly." And he goes on, "Take notice that our brother Timothy has been released." By the way, we saw this constantly in Paul's letters, little, interesting tidbits of information for the readers Take notice that our brother Timothy has been released, with whom, if he comes soon, I shall see you. Now, again, he's writing, the writer here is writing to a group of people, and he's just telling them, you know what, we may get a chance to see each other soon. This is a letter, a private letter. He says, greet all of your leaders and all of the saints. Those from Italy greet you. That's nice. Those from Italy greet you. Grace be with you all. So, again, when you read the New Testament with an ear for what's actually being said and what's actually being written, this is what you have. It's basically what you see is what you get. You have here a number of personal, private letters, epistles that became promoted as divine revelation. So let's move on to verse 5. In verse 5 here, the writer of Hebrews urges his readers to be free from the love of money and to be content with what they have, because God said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. This, by the way, is an example of where the Christian Bible gets it right, meaning that this is a message that is a Torah message, right? This is something which is truth, not because they say it here, because this is already revealed previously in the Jewish scriptures and in the Jewish writings, that we should not be in love with money. We should be content with what we have. And what's interesting is that rather than leave it alone, rather than just state the message, which would have been perfectly fine, the writer tries to back it up and says, why should you be free from the love of money and be content with what you have? Because the writer here says to his readers, because God said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. Now, on some level, the illusion is created. I'm not sure who falls for the illusion, but the illusion is created that, yes, God has said to you people, to you readers of this letter, God said to you, the readers of this letter, I will never desert you, nor I will ever forsake you. Where did God actually say this? Where did God actually say this? Because again, remember, in the Christian Bible, God never speaks. You don't ever see God speaking in the Christian Bible. God is quoted, and these are quotes normally lifted from the Tanakh. So you'll find several places where this sentiment is expressed. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 8, God doesn't speak here. It's Moses speaking about God. And Moses says to the people of Israel, he will not fail you or forsake you. He referring to God. Right? Moses is saying to the people of Israel, God, he will not fail you or forsake you. You do see God speaking these words in the next book of the Tanakh, in the book of Joshua, in the first chapter, in chapter 1, verse 5, God says to Joshua, I will be with you, I will not fail you or forsake you. So the writer of Hebrews here basically continues along in the long-established Christian tradition of appropriating blessings that God gave specifically in context to Israel or to particular Israelites. For example, in the book of Joshua, right, God is making this assurance, this promise, not to every person on the planet. He says to Joshua, you, Joshua, I will be with you, and I will not fail you or forsake you. That's God speaking to Joshua, right? This is always important to bear in mind who is speaking and who is the audience, who is being spoken to. So what the writer of Hebrews does is to appropriate this blessing of God's promise not to forsake, not to fail, and to appropriate it for all of Christendom, right? Meaning that it's what happens is it's not just appropriated for the private audience of the letter of Hebrews, right? We know that this was a letter written to particular individuals, but because this was canonized as part of the Christian Bible, so Christians believe that they are the audience, that this was written to them. It was written for them. So that when God says to Joshua, I will not fail you or forsake you, the Christian reader hears this as God speaking to them, to the Christian reader, that I, God, will not forsake you, Christian reader, Christian audience. Or when God says, to the people of Israel through Moses, right? Moses says that he, God, will not fail you or forsake you. The audience there that Moses is speaking about are the Israelites, the children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so this is a common theme throughout Christian history, is the appropriation of blessings that were given specifically by God to Israel. And it's really what you see, a form, a type of replacement theology that takes place here, right? Because the actual descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's the audience of the book of Deuteronomy. That's the audience of the prophet Joshua. This audience, the descendants, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are replaced by Christians, by believers in Jesus. And of course, this trend of appropriation only appropriates the blessings of the Tanakh, never the curses. I mean, it's interesting that you find God sometimes is promising the people of Israel that if they don't straighten up, they're going to get zapped. They're going to be curses. And those curses are never appropriated by the writers of the Christian Bible. That just never happens. As the church lady used to say, how convenient, how convenient that what gets appropriated are the blessings, never the curses. Okay, moving on to verse 9. The writer of Hebrews is plagued here by some of the same challenges that confronted Paul. We saw in the writings of Paul, he was constantly beset upon by teachers that were challenging him, by teachers that were teaching things that really were not in line with his teachings. Paul was always very, very frustrated by what he referred to as the false teachers, etc. And here the writer of Hebrews seems to be bothered by these same kinds of challenges. Now, it's not clear here in the book of Hebrews what the exact nature of what he refers to in verse 9 here are strange teachings. He's telling his readers, basically, don't get confused and bothered by these strange teachings. So it's not really clear what exactly these strange teachings were that were circulating at the time. But it seems reasonable to think that it may have been along the same fault lines of grace versus works that were always bothering Paul. Paul was constantly dealing with those people who were speaking about the importance of observing the Torah, the importance of following the Torah. And Paul was always insisting that no, you're under grace, not under the law. You're under grace, not under works. And it seems reasonable that that might have been the same issue at play here, because of the history we have with Paul dealing with that very same issue, and also because the writer here stresses, number one, he stresses the importance of grace. He specifically speaks about the importance of grace and contrasts grace with, quote, foods which have not profited those who have been occupied by them. That seems to be the focus of what's going on here in verse 9, that these strange teachings seem to be along this line of really not focusing enough on grace and getting too caught up with foods and what you eat and what you don't eat. And it's interesting that John MacArthur, we've quoted him many times, he's one of the preeminent Protestant commentaries today to the Christian Bible. So he immediately reminds his readers in this verse that, quote, I'm quoting him now, the Mosaic Law had regulations for everything, including food. But he says for Christians, those laws have been abrogated. Those laws have been abrogated. Now, of course, for Gentile Christians, for Christians living at that time who were Gentiles, they were never given those laws in the first place, meaning Gentile Christians never had to observe the dietary laws of the 5 books of Moses, of the Tanakh, of the Torah. These laws were given specifically to Israel. So this is not really an issue, meaning that there's no reason to get all hot and bothered about whether Gentile Christians have to observe these dietary laws, because these were never incumbent upon them in the first place. But it would be safe to say, I'm convinced of this, it would be safe to say that according to John MacArthur, his statement about the dietary laws being abrogated for Christians would be referring to Jewish followers of Jesus as well. Right? He would say that, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, MacArthur would say that these laws from the Torah have been abrogated. There's no longer, he would insist, any need to worry about whether the food you're eating is kosher or not kosher. And this, of course, is a huge problem for Christians like MacArthur, which, by the way, is about 99% of Christians, right? The Messianic Jews and Hebrew roots people or whatever, who are trying to have some form of Torah observance are really a minuscule number of Christians. And so for the vast majority of Christians who would agree with MacArthur that these laws of kashrut, the dietary laws, were abrogated for all Christians, whether you're a Jewish Christian or a Gentile Christian. And that is a huge problem, because under whose authority were these divine laws, divine eternal laws, abrogated? Says who? So unfortunately, all MacArthur is able to say is, well, that's what we heard from Paul, right? You don't see Jesus ever saying those kind of words. you basically see this falls in the lap of Paul primarily. And, this is a unanswerable question. This is a checkmate kind of question. Because, if the people of Israel heard from God at Mount Sinai, that the laws of the Torah are eternal forever throughout your generations, unto 1,000 generations. And Paul comes along and says, well, I tell you that you don't have to keep them anymore. And Paul is obviously, if you pressed him, he wouldn't say that he's making this up. He wouldn't say this is on my authority. Paul's going to insist. God told me, right? I'm giving you the revelation that I heard from God. But that's the critical problem here for the Christian Bible. This testimony of Paul, right? If he's saying that, look, I know that a long time ago, God told all of Israel that the laws of kashrut, the dietary laws, are to be observed. But listen, I want you to know that God told me, this was not a public revelation, right? God had a private conversation with me. I just want you all to know that what God told me, Paul is saying in effect, is that you no longer have to keep these laws. If that's the case, that is proof positive that Paul is a false prophet, that Paul cannot be listened to, and that we should completely disregard Paul, because this is the textbook definition of a false prophet, someone who contradicts prior revelation. If you read Deuteronomy 13, this is basically the chapter of the false prophet, and this is one of the criteria that if the prophet tells you, right, not to follow the laws of Moses, the laws that were given by Moses. So this is a massive, massive problem for the writers of the Christian Bible, for Christianity in general. And, over the years, I've personally heard from hundreds and hundreds of Christians, and they tell me that there are two major problems they have with Christianity is, number one, the belief that Jesus was God. They just cannot accept such an idea. And two, that God's eternal laws that were revealed in the Torah are not taken seriously. They're not observed. And, this is I think a fatal problem for Christianity. Again, not for Gentile Christians. They were never under the law. They were never given these commandments. But Christianity, I think Orthodox normative Christianity would say that today, even for a Jewish follower of Jesus, these laws have been abrogated. Oops, that's their problem. By saying that, they are basically impeaching themselves. One last topic, which is in verses 11 and 12. So here, the writer speaks about the offerings for sin, the offerings in the temple. And I don't want to get too technical here, but basically what we need to know, we need to understand, is that the business end of sin offerings, right? When sin offerings were brought in the Holy Temple, when they were brought in the tabernacle. So what's the essence? What's the crux of the sin offering? So number one, the most critical, important part of the sin offering is when its blood was sprinkled onto the altar. That's the working part, the business end. That's the critical part of the sacrifice. And the second part is where certain remaining, when certain parts of the animal were then burnt on the altar in the temple. Now, we're told that for certain sacrifices, the remaining parts of the animal, that were not burnt on the altar in the temple, they were taken outside the camp and they were burnt there. But it's very important to remember and to understand that this was not a sacrifice. The remaining parts of the animal that were burnt outside the camp, this is basically a way of disposing of these parts of the animal. The sacrifice of the animal, the formal sacrifice that had any effect, that did anything, and that was the actual ritual that God prescribed, was number one, the sprinkling of the blood. The blood was collected into a vessel, and then it was sprinkled onto the altar. And then there were parts of the animal that were burnt on the altar. However, the writer of Hebrews here speaks of Jesus suffering outside the gate so that he could sanctify the people. For some reason, the writer of Hebrews just gets distracted and loses focus and forgets about the blood sprinkled on the altar in the temple, forgets about the parts of the animal that were burnt on the altar in the temple, and for some reason gets all focused on the parts of the animal, the leftovers basically, the remainder of the animal that was taken outside the camp and burnt there. And the writer of Hebrews basically parallels Jesus to those parts of the animals that were burnt outside the camp. And he says, and that's how the believers in Jesus are sanctified, because he was basically suffering outside the gates. Now we know that Jesus was not sacrificed, if we want to even speak of him as a sacrifice. He was not sacrificed in the temple. His blood was never sprinkled on the altar of the temple. And there was a temple that was standing in Jerusalem at that time. Sacrifices were being offered. And the writer of Hebrews, and Christians in general here, seem to forget one of their most favorite verses in the entire Tanakh, Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, which says that God has given you blood upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. So, for some reason, this idea, the centrality of the blood being sprinkled on the altar of the temple, that seems basically to have fallen by the wayside. And there seems to be some need here or agenda to support the idea that whatever happened to Jesus on the cross outside the precinct of the temple, that somehow gets paralleled to the burning up of the remainder parts of the animals that were sacrificed in the temple. And that seems to maybe be the way in which Jesus becomes a sacrifice, that just like the remainder of those animals was burnt outside the camp, Jesus was crucified outside the camp. That's where he suffered, and that's how he becomes a sacrifice. Of course, the burning of the animal parts outside the camp, that was not a sacrifice. It didn't accomplish anything. And the actual sacrifice and everything that it accomplished, and its entire institution and its entire procedure, was done inside the tabernacle or inside the temple, with, again, its blood being sprinkled on the altar. So again, another massive, massive problem for the writer of Hebrews here, and for the whole Christian enterprise in general. There are dozens of reasons why Jesus was not a sacrifice, could not have been a sacrifice, and notwithstanding all of the efforts to, sort of cram this square peg into a round hole, there's just no justification for the belief that Jesus died for anyone's sins. This is just completely contrary to the entire thrust of the Tanakh. So with that, we turn the page on the last chapter of Hebrews. And again, William, I'm looking forward to, God willing, doing with you the book of James very soon.
That sounds fantastic. And it took a while, but we got through it. And I'm still looking forward to our next journey after we get all the way through the tail end. And I know a lot of people are really, really waiting to hear, of course, the final book or letter in Revelation, because there's a lot of really, really interesting stuff.
Oh, that's going to be like a trip.
Yeah, that's going to be the final home run. Bases loaded.
That is going to be a trip.
Right. For sure. All right, you guys. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Rabbi, it's been great, and look forward to seeing you same time, same place next week. Hashem willing. Y'all have a great week. Take care, everybody.
Shalom,
Peace.
shalom.
Shalom.